Introduction. The Aztec and Inca civilizations of the Americas rivaled their Old World counterparts in the size of their cities and the degree of influence over geographical areas. They were radically different from one another. Yet they are united by the fact that they both interacted directly with Europeans. It was out of this traumatic contact situation that came American culture, which transformed the world. Because of the contentious nature of the contact between cultures during the Age of Discovery, or that period immediately following 1492, surprisingly little of a certain factual nature can be said about the inner religious dimensions of Aztec and Inca civilizations. Indeed, more can be discovered about these civilizations by examining them with reference to European civilizations. It is the gaps between various understandings of religion that take us a long way towards understanding ancient America. In the languages of neither the Aztecs, Nahuatl, nor the Incas, Quechua, is there a word equivalent to religion. In these civilizations there are no religious institutions which are autonomous to other political or economic institutions. But if one looks to the literal meaning of religion from the Latin ligare, which means to bind, then there is ample evidence of religion among the Aztecs and Incas. But its emphasis is on a ceremonial binding together rather than on textual binding together. Therefore, the character of religion in the Americas was very different from its character in Europe and the Old World. The binding feature of Aztec and Inca urban existence was the constant emphasis on their cities as primarily ceremonial centers. The political and economic functions of Tenochtitlan for the Aztecs and Cusco for the Incas were secondary to their ceremonial function. Another way in which religion is an understandable concept among ancient American civilizations is in the sense of religion as orientation. According to Map 11.1, the cultural areas of the Aztec, Mayas and Incas with sites discussed in the chapter. Long's definition, 1986. 7. Religion is orientation in the ultimate sense of how one comes to terms with the ultimate significance of one's place in the world. For the Aztecs and Incas, this religious sense of orientation can be taken literally in terms of how they situated themselves with reference to seen and unseen material realities. There is no direct textual record written by the Aztec people, however, that reveals to the scholar the deepest religious meanings of ancient American civilizations. Instead, evidence of these religions come to us through the 16th century contact between the Spanish and the Aztec and Inca civilizations. Even though the Americas contained a number of urban civilizations through time, it is best to begin with the Aztecs and Incas who made direct contact with Europeans. It is significant, therefore, that what are currently regarded as the religions of the Aztecs and Incas have been created in the popular and scholarly imaginations. But the creative endeavor of imagining these splendid civilizations does not imply that our current formulations are uninteresting or wrong. Rather, scholars of ancient American civilizations ply their imaginations on various kinds of source materials to comprehend the inner dimensions of these cultures. The academic study of ancient American religions, more than the study of other ancient religions, is a process of sifting and filtering various kinds of evidence. The Aztecs and Incas in the popular and scholarly imaginations. Academic interest in the Aztec and Inca civilizations has been consistent since contact with Europeans in the 16th century. But the reasons for that interest have changed dramatically. In the early colonial period, the interest that Catholic priests had in these people's traditions and their language was directly connected with missionization. During the later colonial period, often religious understandings were connected with legal issues related to land transfers or ceremonial customs. In the 18th and 19th centuries, there was speculation that these civilizations were connected with Old World ones. This generated intense interest among early archaeologists. In the 20th century there was a general celebration of these civilizations in the art, theater and literature of Latin America. In Mexico and Peru, for example, there is the general recognition that the Aztec and Inca cultures contributed directly to the current formulation of those countries' unique cultural identity. This understanding continues in spite of the fact that current Nahuatl and Quechua-speaking people, as well as other indigenous people throughout the Americas, are among the most despised and disadvantaged. What follows is an account of current scholarly understandings of Mesoamerican, i.e. those civilizations of Central America which predate, include and follow the Aztecs and Inca civilizations. It will serve as a general history from which to conceptualize the religious dimensions of these civilizations. The Olmecs, Mother Culture. Olmec is a Nahuatl word that means people of the rubber trees. The Olmecs had an urban civilization which developed in the lowlands of Mexico in southern Veracruz and western Tabasco near the Gulf of Mexico about 1800 BCE. Reference to the rubber trees ties this civilization to its place of origin. The principal features of these cities were pyramid structures, which served as focal points of ceremonial life. As there are no surviving written records from these people, what is known of these religions comes solely from archaeological evidence. Over several decades of excavations, scholars have had to imagine rigorously what the religious life of the Olmecs was like. Above all else, it is clear that what is distinctive about Mesoamerica, i.e. ceremonial pyramidal architecture, ancestor cult and veneration of food plants, came into being with the Olmecs, leading the Mexican artist and scholar Miguel Covarrubias to characterize this as the mother culture. The intensification of agriculture made possible the rise of Olmec civilization. Most important was the development of maize. Olmec religion, therefore, was an extension of agricultural practices. Ceremonies would follow the agricultural cycles of rainy and dry seasons. Emphasis seems to have been placed on the hydrological cycles, on the spiritual dimensions of seeds and particularly on planting. For example, at San Lorenzo a Jaguar mosaic floor was discovered. The Jaguar motif, which persisted throughout Mesoamerica up until the Aztec period, was associated with the Earth Lord symbolism. When the tile floor was removed, another similar Jaguar mosaic was discovered underneath. When that floor was removed, another was discovered, and so on down to a depth of 10 m. This indicates that the Olmec built architecture that was interior to the earth, thereby emphasizing the importance of the underworld in the regeneration of life. Striking features of Olmec art and iconography are the giant basalt heads, which stand about 2 m high and often weigh 80 tons and would have been transported over several kilometers. Because these heads often have a highly individual character, it has been hypothesized that they were created to represent deceased Olmec rulers, indicating that ancestor worship held an important place in Olmec religion. Worship of important dead rulers was an important feature of the processes by which the Olmec bound themselves together. But the stone heads also indicate a connection to the earth similar to the Jaguar mosaic floors. While the heads are above ground, the body of the ancestor is directly associated with the earth, or was the earth. As with other Native American civilizations, ancestors were directly connected with agricultural processes. The Olmecs initiated a pattern for rulership in Mesoamerica in which the leader of the city was seen as being directly responsible, in life and death, for maintaining agricultural fertility, thereby promoting the health and well-being of his people. Ceremonial buildings were designed to replicate the local landscape. The Olmecs were the first in the Americas to build pyramids. Unlike the Egyptians, the Olmec used pyramids as ceremonial platforms, which would often duplicate the mountainous topography on the horizon. In addition, there is evidence that the design of the urban center was associated with the movements of the sun and moon as well as other planets and constellations. The ceremonial spaces of the Olmecs were designed so as to integrate a range of natural phenomena. According to Wheatley, this urban design was to promote an intimate parallelism between microcosmic and macrocosmic patterns. The Olmecs were interested in integrating their existence with the larger cosmos in order to promote life through ceremonial activity. Since their discovery, the Olmecs have fascinated the modern world. However, many in both popular and scholarly communities have insisted that this advance could not have been indigenous to the New World. There is a tremendous range of suggested places from which the Olmec are supposed to have come, including Egypt, ancient Israel, being one of the lost tribes, Africa, Polynesia, Northern Asia and outer space. Some of these hypotheses are more likely than others. What is clear is that we will never know for sure if the Olmecs originated from another place or, if so, exactly where that place may have been. What is clear, however, is that the Olmecs themselves did not emphasize their having come from another place, in their religious ceremonies. Instead, they consistently emphasized their being situated in their own place. What is more, their ceremonial buildings and activities serve to highlight the importance and meaning of being in their place, through an association with agriculture and ancestors. In spite of the fact that the Olmecs had the first urban civilization, therefore, their ceremonies emphasized an indigenous sensibility. It is in this sense of an indigenous urban existence that Fig. 11.1. The city of Tayatewakan looking south from the top of the Temple of the Moon along the Street of the Dead. Temple of the Sun is to the left. Photograph by the author. The Olmecs are the mother civilization which truly characterized the religions of ancient American civilization. The great city of Tayatewakan. Perhaps the most impressive pre-Columbian site in Central America is Tayatewakan, Fig. 11.1. The pyramids of the Sun and Moon are familiar images on travel posters and brochures beckoning tourists to visit the wonders of central Mexico, Fig. 11.2. The remains of the once great city of Tayatewakan, 100 to 700 CE, give the viewer a sense of its having once been the center of the world. As impressive as it is, however, very little is known of Tayatewakan's builders or inhabitants. As with the Olmecs, archaeology is the only means for understanding the religion of Tayatewakan. There is currently no knowledge of the ethnicity or language of its creators. This very lack of knowledge has tended to promote a fascination with the site. Tayatewakan was named by the Aztecs, and means place of the gods. It figures prominently in Aztec, 1325 to 1521 CE, creation myths, see below, and there is evidence that they performed ceremonies, which may have included human sacrifice at this place. Like the modern traveler to this site. Fig. 11.2. The Temple of the Sun at Tayatewakan. Photograph by the author. The Aztecs were impressed with its magnitude and splendor. In addition to archaeological evidence, therefore, much of the current fascination and understanding of the site comes through the Spanish contact with the Aztecs. As a mythic center, Tayatewakan is perhaps more important than it was when originally occupied. There are important clues to the ceremonial life of the inhabitants of Tayatewakan, which are embedded in its urban design and architecture. As is the case throughout ancient America, the meanings of these remains are constantly transforming with new excavations and discoveries. For example, for most of the 20th century it was thought that the Pyramid of the Sun and the Pyramid of the Moon, the principal ceremonial structures of Tayatewakan, were dedicated to a solar and lunar cult. Now, as a result of different interpretations and more thorough excavations from the 1970s to the 1990s, scholars think that its central cultic structure was water and cave, or underworld, symbolism. The cardinal orientation of the city thus seems to be associated with water and the movement of important celestial bodies, including the Sun, the Moon and the Pleiades. The major axis of the city, called the Street of the Dead, connects the pyramids of the Sun and the Moon. It is actually a series of ascending ceremonial platforms which probably featured various rituals. Tayatewakan has been excavated intermittently since the 1930s. In the 1960s, an extensive mapping project of the region by Millen yielded some very important information. First, that the city was much bigger than once thought. At its peak around 700 CE, as many as 200,000 people may have lived there. Second, that its structure was very uniform, following a rigid, near-cardinal orientation. Even the river, which bisects the city, was rerouted to follow the grid design. Aspects of the city layout indicate the Teotihuacano's religious orientation. In the 1970s, Avani discovered that the alignment of the city corresponds with the setting of the Pleiades on the horizon at the beginning of the rainy season. That the Teotihuacanos knew about the correspondence of the Pleiades star constellation and the beginning of the rainy season is indicated by a series of pecked crosses, which are an arrangement of small indentations carved in a plaster floor or rock. These markings are numerically related to the agricultural calendar and are located in Tayatewakan at strategic locations for viewing celestial events. These disparate data collected throughout the 20th century indicate that Tayatewakan was designed and built with reference to the movement of water, which was so important to agricultural life, and therefore to the success of the city itself. But water was intimately connected with the movement of the stars and the local geographical features, which in turn were integrated into the urban design. As mentioned above, as a result of recent excavations around the Pyramid of the Sun and the Quetzalcoatl Pyramid at the southern end of the Street of the Dead, scholars now think that Tayatewakan was primarily dedicated to material exchanges between human and divine beings. It is now thought that while the obsidian trade, a volcanic glass used in the manufacturing war clubs, may have been responsible for Tayatewakan's rise to prominence in Mesoamerica, it was its ceremonial emphasis on water and food symbolism that made up its core religious values. Two important deities, Quetzalcoatl, the plumed serpent, and Tlaloc, the deity of rain and fertility, first appear at Tayatewakan, Fig. 11.3. These are Nahuatl names given to them by the Aztecs, but they have probably continuously exerted a religious influence throughout Mesoamerica up until the present time. Quetzalcoatl was a significant figure in the myth history of the Toltecs, and images of Tlaloc appear in the Maya area. Both of these illustrate the dominant influence of Tayatewakan in shaping the urban landscape of Mesoamerica. Fig. 11.3. Tlaloc brazier from the Templo Maya. Photograph by the author. Mythic Tollens. Just as the Olmecs and Tayatewakan dramatically influenced the Mesoamerican world, likewise the mythic stature of Tollon continues to organize our understanding of the cultures of central Mexico. Tollon is associated with the pre-Columbian site of Tula in central Mexico, where the Toltecs held dominance, 900 to 1100 CE. As the ideal city, Tollon became the model for rulers throughout Mesoamerica. It therefore had less importance as the specific site of Tula and more influence as a model upon which rested urban authority through its ceremonial functions. The mythic status of Tollon and the ideal capital ruled by the priest-king is of primary importance. According to these myths, the priest Quetzalcoatl once ruled in a peaceful kingdom. Unlike his rivals, Quetzalcoatl was said to sacrifice only butterflies and was loved by his subjects. The trickster figure Tezcatlipoca was his rival, who magically duped Quetzalcoatl into getting intoxicated and sleeping with his sister. Ashamed and dejected, Quetzalcoatl left his kingdom, sailing across the sea to the east. But before he left, he swore that he would return to assume his throne once again. The Aztecs embraced the myth of Quetzalcoatl so as to authorize their rise to prominence in the Valley of Mexico. Their Tlatoani, or principal speakers such as Moctezuma, understood that their power rested squarely with the mythic structure of Tollon. The peaceful Mayas. One of the most enduring misconceptions regarding the Mayas over most of the 20th century was that they were a peaceful, non-violent people who passively watched the sky. This perspective was perpetrated by a few Mesoamericanists of the previous generation and held sway into the 1970s. Currently, Maya scholars have a much different perception. Now the Mayas are seen as people continuously defending their urban centers from conquerors and also raiding other groups for sacrifices to their gods. As discussed below, the Mayas were often involved in brutal ceremonies of torture, sacrifice and auto-sacrifice to legitimate their connections with deities and ancestors. The Maya area covers the lowlands of Mexico, the Yucatan Peninsula and areas of Guatemala, Belize and El Salvador. What scholars refer to as the Maya was actually not a single cultural group at all, but a tremendously diverse group of city-states with different languages and ceremonial complexes, which span a long time period, 300 to 1400 CE. Ceremonies held at these urban settings were particular to each city, in part through their leaders, and the ancestors of their leaders, who played principal roles in the rituals. The number of cities is unknown, but in general Maya scholars think that there was a classical period, associated with sites such as Tikal, Yaxchilan, Palenque, Uxmal and Copan. After the collapse of the classic Maya period there was a post-classic renaissance in northern Yucatan. The site of Chichén Itzá is most commonly associated with the post-classic return of the Maya. Of the religious innovations of the Mayas during the classical period, the calendar is perhaps the most well-known. Indeed, the depth of Maya knowledge of celestial bodies, mathematics and the calendar has tended to exacerbate the view that they were a peaceful people. Observations of the planets and stars were associated with the migration of the seasons. As at Tayatewakan, the Maya urban centers integrated their concern with agricultural cycles into their urban design and ceremonial events. In particular, observations of the planet Venus played a central role in determining the long count calendar. The disappearance and reappearance of Venus would be recorded in multi-year counts, as in the Dresden Codex, which could integrate Venus cycles with the cycles of the Sun and Moon, as well as other planets and star constellations. The classic Mayas also developed an elaborate system of writing. Deciphering these icons is currently one of the most exciting areas of research in Mesoamerican studies. Icons were inscribed onto stelae, or stone megaliths, which, as at Tikal, were set upright in the ceremonial plaza. Stelae communicate a wide variety of messages but principally contain stories which link the activity of the ruling family with mythic founders and deities. Some have a historical character while others are more mythic in nature, but this distinction, while important for modern civilizations, seems to have been much less important for the Mayas. Notable examples of these stelae are the sarcophagus stone of Pakel at Palenque, the tablets at the Temple of the Cross at Palenque, and the depictions of the rulers' shield Jaguar and Lady Zoc at Yaxchilan. These three depictions of rulers will serve as entry into the religious cosmology of the classic Mayas. Central to Mesoamerican tradition is the ritual use of the human body as an instrument for interacting with the unseen forces responsible for material life. This is most clear with the Mayas as it comes to us through their inscriptions. The sarcophagus lid of Lord Pakel's tomb is a powerful example of the role of the ruler as ancestor. The image on the tomb captures the moment of death. From Pakel's body sprouts an enormous tree just as he descends into the jaws of the Earth Lord. Trees, just as mountains in the central Mexican cities of Tayatewakan and Tollan, played the role of the world center connecting celestial, earthly and underworldly spheres. The Mayas more clearly articulated that the ruler's body was intimately involved with the maintenance of the cosmos. In life and death the ruler was the intermediary between human and otherworldly realms. Maintaining good relationships with the underworld, or Xibalba, was of utmost importance for the Mayas. The Popol Vuh, or the Book of Council, of the Quiche Maya states that the deities of the underworld were the originators of maize and other agricultural produce. Hero twins made an arduous journey to the underworld and were captured by the deities of darkness. By means of their ball-playing skills the twins escaped Xibalba with the agricultural goods. The importance of the connection between agriculture and Xibalba is demonstrated in urban design. Ball courts are a prominent attribute of the ceremonial precinct in both the central Mexican and Maya areas and were the sites of elaborate ceremonial drama. Teams were selected on their abilities to move the solid rubber ball deftly with their feet and hips. The teams scored when the ball was flung through vertically arranged hoops mounted on the side walls. Spectators would also be involved in the game, sometimes wagering all their worldly belongings on a team. The winners of the game were sometimes sacrificed. As well as its connection with Xibalba, the east-west orientation of the ball courts also indicates that there was solar symbolism associated with the game. The succession of rulers was of great importance to the Maya urban structure. Tablets from the Temple of the Cross at Palenque portray the accession of Chanbalam, who was the son of Pakel. Pakel and Chanbalam face one another on either side of the tablet. Pakel is portrayed as already having died. Between the rulers is the cosmic tree, which is perched atop the Earth Lord who is graphically characterized as a monster. This image, therefore, is similar to Pakel's sarcophagus lid in style and substance. This time, However, the intention is of ceremoniously authorizing the status of his son, Chambalam. There were undoubtedly ongoing ceremonial occasions to emphasize and legitimate the succession of Maya rulers. As with the ball courts, the prominent place of these monuments at the center of the ceremonial precincts testifies to their importance in the maintenance of urban life. The lintels of Yaxchilan of Shield Jaguar and Lady Zoc underscore the ceremonial responsibilities of Maya rulers as intermediaries between human and sacred beings. In the first lintel, Shield Jaguar is standing over Lady Zoc, who is pulling a rope of thorns through her tongue. Maya rulers were often required to let their own blood, or perform auto-sacrifice, to re-establish ordered relationships with the gods. The second lintel portrays a vision that resulted as the consequence of Lady Zoc's auto-sacrifice. Out of the burnt offering of paper soaked with her own blood rises a vision serpent. From this creature's mouth comes a deity who forcefully imparts his message to the ruler. There were several reasons why rulers were required to let their own blood. First, it was understood to be the mortar of the cosmos. The body and blood of rulers symbolized the ordered workings of the city, which was a reflection of the cosmos. Second, the blood of rulers was seen as re-establishing proper relationships with sky and underworld beings. These rituals of self-sacrifice substantiated a Maya ruler's authority as an intermediary between human beings and deities of water, land, etc. The ruler was also seen as an intermediary between the urban population and ancestors, who were important for maintaining a sense of community. Third, the ruler would let blood as a method for attaining a vision. Attaining knowledge of the unseen world of the deities and ancestors was a constant source of activity. Divination was intensely practiced throughout Mesoamerica in pre-Columbian times and is still practiced among Maya people. Although the Mayas were astute in their development of art, writing, astronomy, mathematics, agriculture, sports, architecture, etc., they could not now be regarded as a peaceful people. Unlike scholars of the 1940s, current scholars are careful not to confuse the sophistication of their culture with their temperament. As with other civilizations, the urban cultures of the Mayas resulted from the violent rendering of the world. This resulted in the collapse of their cities well before the coming of Europeans. The most accepted hypothesis for the Mayas' collapse is that their jungle environment could not support the continuing increase in population pressure. Yet the Mayas remain as an exceptional pre-Columbian culture. The Bloody Aztecs. While the Mayas were generally regarded over the last century as peaceful, the Aztecs on the other hand have been seen as developing one of the most violent cultures in the world. As with the Mayas, these assumptions about the Aztecs have been overemphasized by those who have wanted to demonize them for various reasons. The Aztec, 1325 to 1521 CE, rise to prominence in central Mexico was relatively late among Mesoamerican cultures. The Aztecs authorized their presence in central Mexico by accentuating the similarities of their culture to those of Olmec, Tayatewakan and Tlaloc. The languages and ethnicity of the people who lived in these places is unknown. In fact, most of what is currently known of the pre-Aztec cultures of central Mexico is filtered through the Aztec conceptions of these people. For example, many of the place names, such as Tayatewakan and Tula, are Nahuatl words. Also, the Aztecs performed their own archaeological explorations and held important ceremonies at these sites. The etymology of the word Aztec is a reference to the story of their migration as a tribe, called the Mexica, from an unknown land north of central Mexico. Nahuatl, the language of the Aztecs, is part of a family of languages called Uto-Aztecan. It seems that the Aztecs indeed originated in the north because Nahuatl is similar to the Hopi, Huicol, Ute and Paiute languages. This land was called Aztlan, or the place of the seven caves. From that place the Aztecs emerged out of the earth, then wandered southward. They were despised and distrusted by those with whom they came into contact. As they wandered they were led by a group of priests who were attempting to divine signs from Huitzilopochtli, Hummingbird on the left, who was their tribal deity. After a long time of being driven from place to place, the Aztecs sought refuge in the marshy cane fields in the middle of Lake Texcoco. Throughout the Valley of Mexico there were enormous salt and sweet water lakes which were a major food resource for the residents. There the priests saw an eagle with a snake in its beak perched on a cactus, which grew out of a rock in the middle of the lake. The eagle was a manifestation of Huitzilopochtli and associated with the sun. This is the hierophany, or manifestation of the sacred, which founded the Aztec capital city of Tenochtitlan. The legacy of the Aztec remains is due to the fact that Tenochtitlan lies beneath Mexico City. Pre-Columbian artifacts are unearthed by virtually every public works project. The significance of Aztec culture for Mexico is exemplified by the hierophany of Tenochtitlan's founding being depicted on the flag. In 1978, electrical workers uncovered an elaborately carved stone near the Great Cathedral and the Zocalo, the central square of Mexico City. They tried to cover up the find because it would delay their work, but it was eventually reported and led to the most important Aztec excavation. The workers had discovered the now famous Coyolxauhqui stone, which lay at the base of the steps of the Templo Mayor, the central temple structure of Tenochtitlan. The Templo Mayor was built and rebuilt by each new ruler of the Mexica, who was called the Tlatoani, i.e. principal speaker. From 1325 to 1521 the temple was enlarged and rededicated on the spot where Huitzilopochtli descended onto the cactus in the middle of Lake Texcoco. The discovery and excavation of the temple radically transformed the scholarly and popular understanding of Aztec civilization. Although there were written descriptions of the temple, it had not been seen since Cortés destroyed Tenochtitlan in 1521. As with the other parts of the city, the Spanish conquistadors leveled the Templo Mayor with cannon fire. For them the temple symbolized the heathen worship of the Aztecs. They used the cut stone of the temple to construct what is now the oldest part of the National Cathedral nearby to the west. The Templo Mayor survives as a series of bases from successive rebuilding stages. When a new temple was to be erected, the old one was carefully buried under the new structure. By the 16th century, therefore, the Templo Mayor was an enormous pyramid. The Templo Mayor functioned as a ceremonial platform. The Nahuatl term for city is Altepetl, water mountain, and refers to the dominant temple which occupied the center of every city, town and hamlet. For Mesoamericans, including the Aztecs, the city was defined by its central temple. When a town was captured by the Aztecs, for example, that event was iconographically represented by the temple having been toppled and set on fire. But the term Altepetl also indicates that the central temple, like the Pyramid of the Sun at Tayatewakan and the Cosmic Tree for the Mayas, was a vertical axis that connected human beings with the sky and the underworld. Mountains were understood to be containers of water. Either too little or too much water could be devastating for agricultural success. As we have seen at other sites in Mesoamerica, the intimate relationships between various aspects of material life were directly involved in the urban planning and the ceremonies. The Templo Mayor is actually two temples in one structure. The southern side of the temple is dedicated to Huitzilopochtli, the tribal god of the Aztecs, and the northern side is dedicated to Tlaloc, the god of rain and fertility, whose earliest appearance is at Tayatewakan. The bifurcated structure is extremely rare among Mesoamerican cities. Only one other bifurcated temple is known. While the Aztecs conquered an enormous area stretching from the Pacific to the Atlantic, they did not seem as interested in imposing their religious structures on subject peoples. Rather, they were interested in the flow of tribute to Tenochtitlan. This is dramatized by the absence of similar bifurcated temples throughout their conquered region. The dominant status of Huitzilopochtli at the Templo Mayor was not surprising to researchers. What was surprising was the absence of images of the god. In fact, no iconographical representations of Huitzilopochtli were found at the site. Yet, as Matos Moctezuma, the archaeologist responsible for the excavations, has said, it was Huitzilopochtli who oversaw the imperial designs of the Aztecs. As god of the sun, Huitzilopochtli was venerated at the Templo Mayor with sacrifices and other offerings. Like the sun, he was omnipresent, but at the same time he was a uniquely Aztec deity. Scholars have been quick to point out that the absence of images of Huitzilopochtli at the Templo Mayor should not be seen as symptomatic of his significance for the Aztecs. Instead, he may have been of great significance as a deus ociosus, a god obscured, or remote. Unlike Huitzilopochtli, the presence of Tlaloc at the Templo Mayor is ubiquitous. For Broder, this indicates that the Aztecs perceived the Templo Mayor as a symbol of absolute fertility. As with the ceremonial centers of Tayatewakan, the Aztecs saw their principal temple as an altepetl, a water mountain, which established the proper connection between human and divine beings for purposes of agricultural success. Huitzilopochtli was the solar god but also the Mexica deity of war and tribute. Tlaloc was the water and fertility god and a pan-Mesoamerican deity of agriculture. In the bifurcated Templo Mayor, therefore, the Aztec venerated deities who symbolized the material well-being of the city of Tenochtitlan. The Aztecs adopted Tlaloc as their own deity and thereby authorized their presence in the Valley of Mexico. Thousands of figurines and statues were found at the Templo Mayor, as well as numerous other artifacts associated with water and fertility. The richest source of Tlaloc material is the offering boxes, which have been found throughout the site and are associated with all phases of the temple's construction. For Lopez Leon, an archaeologist who has worked intensively with the offering boxes, the profusion of Tlaloc material can be read like a book. The various layers of these boxes were intended to represent the different layers of the cosmos. In addition, these layers indicate how Aztec ceremonial life unfolded. Offering box number 48, for example, is a particularly rich example. At the bottom of the box are various shells and corals from both Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. They are laid out in an east-west direction, tracing the path of the sun. Above that were found various objects including jaguar skeletons, beads, figurines of various gods, and jars which symbolize the temple as a container of water. Above these objects were the entire skeletons of 42 children below the ages of 7, with a corresponding number of Tlaloc figurines capping off the box. This offering was dated to 1454 when there was a very serious multi-year drought in central Mexico. In desperation, the Aztecs propitiated the deities of rain, principal of them being Tlaloc, to bring rain. The Aztecs are famous, perhaps infamous, for their use of human sacrifice. These sacrificial rites have held a powerful place in the European imagination, and at certain points in the last 500 years they have assumed mythic proportions. Incidents of human sacrifice in the New World were often emphasized and exaggerated by Europeans in order to justify their colonial operations in the Americas. It is important to note, however, that the Spanish killed millions more people than did the Aztecs. This is particularly ironic given that the intention of the Spanish, as with other Europeans in the New World, was to spread a religion of love. The black legend of the Spanish brutality perpetrated by Bartolomé de las Casas in 1550 was promoted by the Protestant cultures of Northern Europe. Protestants wished to demonize the Spanish Catholics by emphasizing the atrocities throughout the Americas. As horrific as Aztec human sacrifice was, they killed far fewer people in the course of a given agricultural year than did the Spanish. The phenomenon of human sacrifice is no different from similar offering rites. In an exchange economy of relationships with the deities, human sacrifice is the gift among all gifts. Even so, the descriptions of these rites that have survived through the conquest of Tenochtitlan seem to indicate that even among Mesoamerican cultures, who were no strangers to human sacrifice, the Aztecs were known to be particularly bloody in their sacrificial rites. Since the scholarly view of the Mayas has been altered since the 1950s, their counterparts in central Mexico look more similar and less bloody than they had done. The Imperial Incas. As far as scholars can tell, there was no contact between the cultures of Mesoamerica and Peru. There is some evidence that each had knowledge of the existence of the other, but there was no formal interaction. For example, according to Wheatley, Mesoamerican and Peruvian civilizations are 2 of the 7 locations of primary urban generation. This indicates that over the course of their long development each had little direct knowledge of the other's existence. And yet there are a number of similarities between Mesoamerican and Inca civilizations. Both were organized around central ceremonial cities, both had powerful rulers at the center of their social organization, and both have been regarded as imperialistic in the domination of their respective regions. Cusco was the center of the Inca Empire, 1200 to 1533 CE. At its zenith, the Incas exerted influence over an area that extended from Ecuador to Chile. Like Mesoamerican cities, at its center was a notable temple called the Temple of the Sun. The Inca, or ruler, was responsible for maintenance of the ceremonies. The extent of Inca influence covered a vast area. They developed a series of roads that radiated out from Cusco in all directions. Along these roads would travel various sorts of people with tribute that flowed into the Inca center. From 1525 to 1532, two moieties of the empire were at war. The civil war was between two Incas. The term Inca is the title for both the empire and the ruler, Atahualpa and Huascar. Atahualpa eventually won back the rule but was overthrown by Pizarro, the conquistador from Spain, in 1533. As with the Aztecs, what is known of the Incas comes to us primarily through contact with the Spanish. Their descriptions of the city of Cusco are very similar to those of Tenochtitlan in that they tend to emphasize them as paradisiacal. These accounts also emphasize the imperial character of the Inca capital. But there is evidence to suggest that the Incas were not imperial in the same sense as were the Spanish. In areas that were once dominated by the Incas, several native languages were spoken that predate Quechua, or the language of the Inca. Aymara, for example, is still spoken in mountain villages of Bolivia, while Quechua and Spanish are spoken in the lower areas. As with the Aztecs, the Incas tended to allow for a cultural plurality in areas that they controlled and were not interested in missionization as an instrument of social control. This stands in marked contrast with the Spanish and other European empires, which emphasized the necessity of cultural uniformity with respect to language and religion. The Incas were primarily concerned with tribute payments and not with imperial control of the hinterlands. Tribute was utilized in a gift exchange economy, as among the Mesoamericans. At the center of this economy were the gifts given to the deities of the sun, water, the creator god Viracocha, and the moon goddess, as well as numerous other gods. The sources. Pre-Columbian texts, the primary sources. Texts. The irony of an investigation of the primary texts of the civilizations of the Americas is that they are ciphers that cannot be entirely comprehended by the scholarly community. At the outset, we must acknowledge that the interpretation and investigation of these documents is a continuous enterprise that will never be completed. Part of the problem of comprehensibility has to do with the composition of the texts themselves, and whether or not they should be characterized as texts. In the case of Aztec and Maya material, there is a basis for referring to these documents as texts. In the Inca case, however, weaving might be more appropriate than text. Another dilemma is that virtually all of the pre-Columbian texts were destroyed in bonfires set by Catholic missionaries in the 16th century. This action was taken in order that conversion to Christianity would not be compromised by the continuing worship of ancient deities. About 16 pre-Columbian texts survived the blazes because they were sent back to Europe as curiosities, and these texts are housed in libraries primarily in Italy, France, England and Spain. Fig. 11.4. The frontispiece of the Fejaveri Maya, which depicts the Aztec cosmology. The circuitous routes of these documents to their present locations are adventure stories in themselves. Interpretation of the primary texts, therefore, is involved with the phenomenon of cultural contact between old and new worlds. Although they were created by pre-Columbian people, the range of possible meanings of these texts has been transformed by the conquest and colonial periods. The primary texts that have survived come from a variety of cultural areas, but their meanings have been associated with Aztec and Inca civilizations. In Tenochtitlan there were probably several thousand books of painted images, like the Fejaveri Maya, Fig. 11.4, that were used in a variety of ceremonial contexts. Some of these occasions were of a public nature for the entire community and some were for individual households, such as at naming or birth ceremonies. These texts were housed in libraries of the Kamikat, or the schools for training priests. It is likely that they were utilized by experts who were trained to read them by appealing to other material forces such as the flow of blood in the body or climatological activity. In other words, these texts were used in a manner that more closely resembled ritual activity than our present understanding of reading. For the most part, they served as the focal point of divinatory activity and would be consulted to ascertain whether or not an offering or a question for the deity was successfully received. The most significant inroads towards interpreting Mesoamerican texts have been made by art historians rather than linguists, since the ancient cultures of the Americas created texts which were largely based in painted images. While some phonetic elements were paired with images, these texts tended to cluster information around images. Reading the text thus required a high degree of cultural knowledge and sophistication. This is particularly true regarding Maya epigraphic texts because they use images, and in order to read them one must keep a large number of images in mind. This is in contrast to a phonetic symbolic system, such as the alphabet. The primary texts, therefore, tell us less about the facts of Aztec life and more about how they perceived their interaction with the hidden dimensions of the cosmos. Most of the surviving texts are articulations of the tonal pohuali, or the divinatory calendar of 260 days, and the 365-day agricultural calendar. The former was used throughout Mesoamerica. There are various theories of why a 260-day calendar was chosen. Some suggest that this count is close to particular cycles of Venus, but many agree that 260 days is close to 9 months, or the human gestation period, given the centrality of the human body to all Aztec ceremonial activity. Maya diviners continue to utilize the tonal pohuali. According to Tlaloc, who was trained as a diviner, the reader of the days utilizes the pulses of blood in her own body to understand the messages contained in the calendar. Inca primary texts, called quipu, are composed of knotted cords which either radiate outward from a central cord ring or are strung along a rope. Fig. 11.5. Multicolored cords and knots recount to the reader stories, histories and numerical arrangements. In particular, the knots of the quipus may correspond to particular sites called huacas that are connected by invisible sight lines, called secs, situated throughout the surrounding landscape. These knotted cords trace out the sec-huaca system, which maps the interrelationships between the movement of celestial phenomena with reference to features of the landscape. Thus they were also linked closely with ceremonies. These texts may have been used to record calendrical information that would have been used on particular ceremonial occasions, but, unlike the Mesoamerican texts, they do not seem to have been used in divinatory activities. They also numerically record various features of celestial phenomena or tribute. How to read these texts is the source of much debate since, like the codices of central Mexico, they record information to be used in a ritual or performative occasion. Recently 32 quipus were found in a cave in northeastern Peru, and the possibility now exists, therefore. Fig. 11.5. Quipu expert from Guamin Poma de Ayala. That these can be compared with written accounts of the conquest in order to crack the code of the Inca. Like the discovery of the Rosetta Stone in 1799 and the advances in Maya scholarship since the 1970s, Inca scholars may well be able to read quipus in the near future. Ayrton 1981. The texts of the Aztec and the Inca emphasized counting, celestial phenomena and ceremonial activity, but some were also used to keep track of tribute flowing into each of the ceremonial centers. They were meant to be used with reference to a particular landscape by those who had the ability to read them. Unlike the books of the European intellectual tradition, interpretations of these texts was very much embedded in their physical location and the orientation of the reader. They present the scholar with some significant interpretive challenges. Archaeology. The other primary source of information about ancient civilizations of the Americas is the archaeological record. Both the Aztecs and the Incas left considerable physical remnants which are constantly being unearthed and assessed. One of the most exciting aspects of studying these civilizations is that new finds are regularly revealed and, as a consequence, our understanding of them is radically transformed. The Templo Maya and other ceremonial sites, such as the ceremonial complexes at Cholula, have undergone intensive scrutiny over several years, but questions regarding who built them persist. Cholula was a very important religious center that was continuously occupied from the late Olmec through the Aztec period, and yet very little is known about why this city lasted so long or the nature of its influence in the Mesoamerican world. Some have referred to it as the Rome of the New World. Its pyramid is the largest in the world by volume and it was home to a diversity of temples, but it is difficult to assess their importance because currently a Catholic church sits atop the pyramid, which now looks like a large hill. This is also the case with other temples in the area. Cholula thus raises the dilemma of the degree to which one compromises the current religious building to discover more about those underneath. The Templo Mayor presented archaeologists with the difficulties of urban excavations. It sits in the center of one of the most densely populated cities in the world, just north of the Presidential Palace and east of the National Cathedral of Mexico. Fortunately, the few colonial ruins that lay atop the Templo Mayor could be moved or worked around in some fashion. A museum was built to house the vast array of objects taken from the site. Because, like the texts, it was destroyed by the Spanish, the reconstruction of the pyramid has been a laborious and complex process of educated speculations about how it must have looked 500 years ago. The nature of the archaeological enterprise in urban contexts has yielded critical information regarding ancient American civilizations but also increases the number of questions. This is also the case in more remote sites such as Tayatewakan, Tula and Malinalco, as well as numerous lowland sites. Because these sites have been intensively excavated over several generations by scholars who had their own intellectual agendas, the records often create more confusion. In addition, the interpretation of pre-Columbian sites is intimately connected with Mexican cultural identity. For example, in their rush to get the site ready for a national commemoration of the revolution in the early 20th century, Tayatewakan was originally excavated with dynamite. Further, several of these sites are tourist destinations, the most famous including Tula, Chichen Itza, Tikal, Tayatewakan, Xochimilco Xochicalco, Fig. 11.6. And the Templo Mayor. Excavations of tourist areas tend to focus on reconstruction of the sites as they once were, which means that they are building projects as much as they are excavations. Less dramatic, but just as significant, has been the interpretive shift in American archaeology called the New Archaeology. Since the 1950s, fewer monumental buildings have been excavated and interest has concentrated on generating a better understanding of how common people lived in these cities. House mounds rather than ceremonial builds and chinampa fields rather than palace courtyards have been the focus of archaeological labors. This has yielded a fuller picture of the whole spectrum of life from ruler to citizen. The New Archaeology has likewise given us a glimpse of the religion of common people. Often the ethnic identity of a community can be traced through their altar or figurine styles. By emphasizing new questions associated with common people, which would have been regarded as peripheral a century ago, archaeologists have given us a better understanding of the totality of urban life. The central urban position of the Templo Mayor has led to interesting cultural innovations. When Rigoberta Menchú won the 1992 Nobel Peace Prize, she decided to house the medal in the Templo Mayor Museum rather than take it to her home in southern Mexico. Outside the site there are numerous vendors of Aztec-like goods, bookstalls, musicians and dancers, and various political groups have information booths in order to lobby for the rights of indigenous people of Mexico. The Inca were highly skilled stone workers. The temples at Cusco and, 80 kilometers north, the city of Machu Picchu were crafted from very hard stone. No mortar was used in their construction, and yet the joints between stones are so tight that not even the blade of a knife can be inserted between them. Currently, some scholars think that Machu Picchu was a kind of agricultural testing outpost in the Andes where varieties of potato and cereal crops could be genetically selected at high altitude. The numerous terraces and fields at the site are too small to support a large population. In addition to tribute, it was agricultural success that ensured the continuation of the Inca Empire. The breathtaking location of Machu Picchu has attracted large numbers of travelers. Its location has generated numerous interpretations of Inca religion and civilization. As with the Templo Mayor, the site demands the imaginative labors of the tourist, the activist and the scholar. Excavations in areas where Fig. 11.6. Ball court at Xochicalco. Photograph by the author. People, for various reasons, have intense interest in the discoveries yield further questions, further interpretations, and therefore further meanings. The significance of the ancient civilizations of the Americas is never finished. The archaeological record offers us important clues which have to be reconsidered every time someone puts in a new saw line. Ethnography. To the list of primary sources should be added the indigenous people of Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, Peru, Bolivia and other countries. It is estimated that 2 to 3 million people in central Mexico speak Nahuatl, with a comparable number speaking native languages, mostly Maya. In the lowlands of Mexico, 32 different languages are spoken in Mexico. About 10 million native people in Peru, close to half of the population, are Quechua and Aymara speakers. Many of these communities continue to practice versions of the ceremonies of their ancestors, and even though these practices of present-day native people are not directly connected with those of pre-Columbian people, they can nevertheless be regarded as a primary source. Ethnographic upstreaming, i.e. utilizing ethnographic information to evaluate other primary sources, helps overcome some of the problems associated with textual and archaeological resources and often gives scholars insights into the practices of ancient people. Ethnographies tend to inform us about the religious practices of common people rather than about those of ruling classes. A single example is the Mesoamerican understanding and use of paper. In the Codex Mendoza, a text that was created after the conquest but in a pre-Columbian style, paper is shown as a major tribute item that came into Tenochtitlan. Literally tons of paper were transferred to the Aztecs from subject territories. Given that the Aztecs did not write books in the conventional European sense, the question emerges of what the Aztecs were doing with all that paper. According to ethnographies, among the Otomi, Gallinian 1983, and other contemporary Nahuatl speakers, Sandstrom 1991, paper is a very important ritual object that is used to propitiate deities associated with water, seeds and ancestors, as well as a host of other deities. The manufacture of paper is sometimes done by shamans, and ritual specialists cut the paper into the shapes of deities to arrange on altars. With this knowledge, one can revisit the primary texts with a new understanding of the ritual use of paper. Ethnographic knowledge highlights other important aspects of the primary sources in ways that promote new understandings of these ancient civilizations. Colonial texts, the secondary sources. Priestly writings. Many of the most important resources for understanding pre-Columbian civilizations were generated by the conquerors. Of course, this presents us with another ironic situation. They are similar to the primary sources in that colonial texts still tend to obscure the religious worldviews of the Aztecs or the Incas. However, they are dissimilar in that colonial texts nevertheless are generally written in such a way as to present the pre-Columbian past as wholly comprehensible. There is a tendency of colonial writers to speak with an expert knowledge that camouflages the real gaps between colonial and indigenous cultures. In central Mexico, very soon after the fall of Tenochtitlan, there was a flurry of intellectual activity generated by various Catholic orders to learn native languages and codify them in grammars and dictionaries. These texts would then be used to translate official church doctrine, create catechisms or give sermons in Nahuatl. There were also writings intended to record various aspects of the life of the Indians. Both of these endeavors, the linguistic and the ethnographic, were carried out in order to facilitate the conversion of native communities. As a consequence of these labors, Nahuatl became the lingua franca of New Spain, i.e. Mexico. Significant amounts of colonial court records having to do with land transactions and inheritance disputes, for example, were recorded in Nahuatl. The written form of Nahuatl used during the colonial period had been transformed into an alphabetic and phonetic form by Catholic priests. The most important figure in generating this colonial record of pre-Columbian cultures was Fray Bernardino de Sahagun. He was a Franciscan monk who came to Mexico soon after it became New Spain in 1521, after the fall of Tenochtitlan. He dedicated his intellectual talents to learning Nahuatl, a project that was already underway. Over approximately a 40-year period, from 1530 to 1570, Sahagun collected information related to all facets of Aztec life. The most complete record of this work is the General History of the Things of New Spain, commonly referred to as the Florentine Codex. It is currently housed in the Laurentian Library in Florence, Italy. The Florentine is an encyclopedic work in 13 volumes which covers pre-Columbian understandings of the gods, ceremonies, moral philosophy, the natural world and the conquest. The work is ahead of its time in that Sahagun dispassionately records the totality of Aztec culture in a systematic and detailed fashion. Sahagun's method has earned him the title of the father of American ethnography. But very little is known about Sahagun the man. This information could help scholars understand why he approached the descriptive task the way that he did, the consequence of which was to create a new way of interacting with other civilizations and cultures. There were many other priests who wrote about the Aztecs, including the Dominican Fray Diego Duran. Duran's insights are valuable in that he was born and reared in New Spain and was in constant contact with Nahuatl-speaking people and thus had a familiarity with Aztec customs. What Sahagun and Duran share is an extreme antagonism towards Aztec religion as well as towards the figurehead of the religion, the Aztec priest. Although Sahagun does not dwell on his prejudice, he does begin and end each volume of the Florentine with a diatribe against the false religion he is setting out to record. Duran is less disciplined about attacking what he sees as diabolic in Aztec tradition and frequently editorializes in the midst of his writing about the Aztecs. The interpretive dilemma is, therefore, how to know when to filter out the prejudice of the priestly writings in attempting to look at the civilizations that predated their creation. Even though priestly writings, written in a post-Columbian world, constitute a very important resource in understanding pre-Columbian cultures, how reliable are they when their authors were so firmly dedicated to eradication of those same cultures? This is an even more vexing problem when dealing with the topic of religion. As alluded to above, one of the most glaring omissions from these texts is the Aztec priest. In the Florentine there are only scant, even cryptic references to these religious leaders because they were considered by Catholic priests as the archenemy of the promotion of Christianity in the New World. Yet the priesthood of Mesoamerica was an institution which developed over the course of millennia and, had we known more about it, could have significantly impacted upon our appreciation of religious innovation. Accounts of the conquistadores. Both Cortés and Pizarro were in direct contact with the Aztecs and the Incas respectively. Their writings, therefore, are key secondary sources for knowing about these people. In Mexico it is also the case that one of Cortés' men, Bernal Diaz de Castillo, wrote an important text several years after the fall of Tenochtitlan. Both Cortés and Pizarro, however, were keenly aware of their positions as agents of the crown. Moreover, both were very ambitious and so wanted to present their actions in the best possible light. In his letters to the Spanish monarch, Cortés tends to emphasize the wonders of his discoveries in the New World and the need for someone to be appointed viceroy of the New World, such as himself, who would be most able to bring the riches to the king most effectively. Pizarro speaks similarly of the Inca cities and the possibilities of gold extraction. These men had a keen eye for what use their discoveries might have for Spain and were therefore less curious about what they actually saw. This is unfortunate but understandable given the military cunning of both of them. Being a foot soldier with little or nothing to lose, Diaz del Castillo on the other hand had nothing to gain immediately from the conquest. It is in his writing that we can begin to appreciate the first impressions of Tenochtitlan as a paradisal place from the perspective of a complete outsider. His account was written long after the conquest and is therefore subject to the problems of memory. Native narratives. There are a few accounts of pre-Columbian life written by prominent native authors. These authors are significant in that they would have had to have sufficient means to re-educate themselves in a Spanish system. Notable among them is Felipe Guamin Poma de Ayala, who chronicled the Inca world together with its conquest by the Spanish. As with Sahagun, Guamin Poma's life story is difficult to assess. He was born very close to the time of the conquest of Cusco and lived most of his life in Spain. He completely dedicated himself to the task of writing about the Incas and their demise. He characterized his writing as weeping about the end of the world. His account is perhaps the most valuable for our gaining entrance into the Inca world in that his perspective represents the native view. His account is also from the perspective of someone who underwent the transition from an Incan to a Spanish worldview in the scope of a single lifetime. Other native authors set down in writing family histories and mythic narratives. Often these were recorded by the once ruling class families who, during the colonial era, still had some legal title to land and aristocratic status in the courts. Many of these texts were written as attempts to legitimate one's connection to an ancestor to ensure survival under the Spanish crown. When reading the secondary sources to understand pre-Columbian cultures, one is constantly aware of the various interpretive agendas at work. To compound the problem, however, there is the generally remote nature of the primary evidence. The work of interpreting pre-Columbian American civilization requires an ability of the scholar to weigh and integrate a great variety of evidence. None of the texts, experiences, or physical evidence is adequate in itself. In attempting to interpret these civilizations, the scholar must be continually aware of the profound trauma of the conquest. With that does not come a demoralization that nothing certain can be understood of these cultures. On the contrary, the dexterity required in sifting various kinds of evidence can be satisfying in that new discoveries tend to emerge out of old material once thought to be completely and finally known. The imaginative abilities of the scholar to sort through various types of evidence can yield important new angles with which to view these ancient civilizations. Below are some examples of how different kinds of evidence can come together in order to help us understand Aztec and Inca mythic and ceremonial life. Religion and ritual life. For both the Aztecs and the Incas, understandings of how the cosmos was created were directly related to their ceremonial life. This section will utilize a variety of primary and secondary source materials to relate their distinctive creation myths and connect those with ritual activities. Central to both cases were their respective perspectives on the human body and the necessity of giving back to the deities a measure of life that humans have been given. Both cultures emphasized rituals involving human sacrifice to establish cosmological order. The Aztecs. The Aztecs lived in an age known as the Fifth Sunday. It was preceded by 4 previous suns which were all known by their destruction. The creation of the fifth sun took place at Tayatewakan, the city of the gods. It was there, in total darkness, that 2 gods agreed to throw themselves into the fire to create the new Sunday. The first was a boastful and handsome deity and the second was a sickly deity. The first could not summon the courage to throw himself into the fire pit, however, so the creation was in jeopardy. The sickly god, Nana Watson, eagerly threw himself into the fire. After his auto-sacrifice, the other deities all threw themselves into the fire, thereby ensuring that the sun would rise again and the fifth age would begin. Read 1998. Central to the Aztec cosmogony is the willing sacrifice of the gods to usher in the new Sunday. Likewise, it was understood that human beings also had the responsibility to perform auto-sacrifices at regular intervals of time to keep the sun moving. The relationship between human sacrifice and movement of time is strongly emphasized in the myth of the birth of Quetzalcoatl, the god of the sun. Once the mother of the earth, Coatlicue, Serpent skirt, was sweeping out the temple at the top of Olmecs, or the sacred water mountain. A small ball of feathers fell down from the sky and Coatlicue caught it and tucked it into her blouse. After this she immediately became pregnant. Her daughter the moon, Quetzalcoatl, and her sons, called the 400 Southerners, were enraged that their mother should get pregnant in such a scandalous way and not have a proper husband. Quetzalcoatl and her brothers, the 400 Southerners, decided that they would kill their mother. With their battle gear they marched up Olmecs and the sound of their approach frightened their mother. But deep within her womb she heard a calming voice which assured her that there was nothing to fear. A little while later she again heard the approaching army of her children and again she heard the calming voice from her womb telling her that everything was as it was supposed to be. Just as Quetzalcoatl and the 400 Southerners were about to break into the temple, Quetzalcoatl sprang from his mother's womb in full battle array and decapitated his sister Quetzalcoatl. Her body then fell down Olmecs and became dismembered in the process. She came to rest at the bottom of the hill but was broken into pieces. As for the 400 southerners, Huitzilopochtli chased them, scattering them to lands far away. This myth takes place at the Templo Mayor. It also accounts for why the Coyolxauhqui stone, the find that initiated the excavation in 1978, would have been found at the bottom of the Huitzilopochtli side of the temple. The myth also recounts daybreak, at which time the sun is born from the earth, at the horizon, and the moon and stars, i.e. the 400 southerners, are vanquished. As with the creation myth of the fifth sun, this story emphasizes the importance of human death in perpetuating the cosmic order. The mythic theme of human sacrifice as an integral part of the temporal order of the cosmos is a common one in Aztec ritual. A particularly important ritual event, however, was the new fire ceremony, or two-reed. It took place every 52 years, which was the number of years required for the 260-day divinatory calendar and the 365-day agricultural calendars to be resynchronized with one another. The resynchronization took place on the day named Two-Reed and was thus the name of the ceremony. It took place on a hill south of Tenochtitlan, now called the Hill of the Star. Before the ceremony, all fires were extinguished throughout the entire Aztec area. Clay pots which were fired in furnaces were broken and children were hidden in granaries to prevent their being turned into mice during this dangerous moment of chaos. A sacrificial victim was led to the spot on the hill by the priests of Tenochtitlan. At midnight, or when the star constellation of the Pleiades was directly overhead, the priests laid the victim on a stone, cut open his chest and offered the blood to the deities. In his chest cavity the priest lit a new fire. The fire was then distributed to everyone throughout the empire. From the perspective of the Aztec mythology, this ritual restored a temporal structure by giving the sun human blood. Thus, the two calendars were restored from the chaos of darkness. The Incas. The creator deity of the Incas was Viracocha, Sea of Fat. Viracocha was the eternal creator of all beings on the earth. His other titles named him as the foundation of the earth and its lord. He is also associated with the Milky Way. His position in the cosmos, therefore, was above all celestial and earthly phenomena. Yet he was continually involved with his companions who oversaw various areas of the creation. A temple at Cusco was dedicated to Viracocha. In it was a statue in human form which was said to be made of gold and about the size of a 10-year-old boy. Out of the southeast, the direction from which the sun was born, Viracocha came walking towards the northwest with two of his companions. As he walked over the land he named things. It was through the act of walking and naming that the world was created. He had previously drawn the images of the things he had named on the island at Lake Titicaca. At that place he used the images to rehearse his cosmogonic sojourn. He then ascended into the high sky, or heaven. Important for the creation story is that where Viracocha rehearsed his creation and where he eventually departed from the earth have a specific geographical referent. Cusco was arranged into moieties, which were then divided again to become associated with the four cardinal directions. Further subdividing the Inca capital were some 400 divisions of holy sites, called sacs. These lines continued to the farthest extent of the empire. Care for these sites was assigned to be the work of a social group. Thus religious and social organization was maintained through the sect system. The festival of Capac Hutcha required the sacrifice of children to the deities of rain and fertility. The group responsible for giving the children to the Incas either sent them to the center via the sect line or would walk to their homeland from Cusco along the sect line. In the latter case the children would then be sacrificed at a home hoaka, or holy site. During fertility ceremonies at Cusco the Inca ruler was required to open the ground using a planting stick. His activity reproduced the activities of Viracocha. In addition, mummies of previous Inca rulers would be carried on litters over the ceremonial planting grounds. It was understood that the movement of the ruler's desiccated bodies had a fertilizing effect on the land. Contemporary Aymara-speaking groups in Bolivia still have an oral memory of these traditions. Always known to be capable diviners, these groups recall having served the Incas in the capacity of litter bearers. The Inca practice of mummification was seen as removing fat from the body. For current groups, the soul is directly connected with the liquids of the body. The mummified body of the Inca ruler and the bodies of children, therefore, would have had associations with the seeds and the fructifying ability of fat, or bodily energy. Today, the indigenous peoples still use the fat of animals in various rituals associated with planting and healing. In addition, the sec lines are reminiscent of the creative labors of Viracocha. The Inca sec-coarca system, their division of the empire into moieties and cardinal directions, and their intricate system of roads were all associated with the cosmogonic sojourn of Viracocha. Survivals of ancient civilized religions in Latin American Catholicism. Aztec and Inca religions have not disappeared but, after the trauma of colonialism, have adapted themselves to the religious conditions of the New World. Estimates of current numbers of indigenous people in Mexico and Peru vary, but in both countries they constitute a major portion of the population, if not the majority. Their social status has not much improved since the colonial period, in spite of the fact that the ancient civilizations from which they have descended are a source of profound nationalistic pride. There is therefore a wide variety of indigenous movements in Mexico and Peru which have been connected with other indigenous people from throughout the Americas and the rest of the world. It is precisely the indigenous emphasis of contemporary groups in interpreting their ancient urban roots that unites their religious innovations since the conquest by Spain. Throughout Latin America, beginning soon after the conquest, there have been several apparitions of the Virgin Mary, who appears as a black or Indian virgin. Prominent among these hierophanies is the Virgin of Guadalupe, Fig. 11.7. Since as early as 1540 she has been the symbol of Mexican identity as a creative combination of pre-Columbian and Catholic worldviews. In 1531, which was just 10 years after the fall of Tenochtitlan, a Nahuatl-speaking man named Juan Diego was walking by a hill called Tepeyac. At the hill he encountered the dark-skinned Virgin Mary, who sternly instructed him to go to see the Archbishop of Mexico and have him build a cathedral at that site in her honor. When Juan Diego went to the Archbishop's palace, he was rejected by the guards. As he walked home by Tepeyac, he again encountered the Virgin and she instructed him to pick some flowers that were miraculously blooming out of season. Juan Diego gathered the flowers in his cloak, which was a native Aztec garment, and carried them back to the Archbishop's palace. This time the guards wanted to see what Juan Diego was concealing in his cloak. In the scuffle they all discovered that an image of the Virgin of Guadalupe was magically formed on Juan Diego's cloak. The apparition was recognized as the Virgin of Guadalupe in Spain, where there have been other Marian apparitions. Recently the miracle of the Virgin of Guadalupe was recognized by the Vatican. In December each year millions of Mexicans crawl on their knees to the basilica erected on Tepeyac in veneration of the Virgin's appearance at that site. But the site of Tepeyac was also where an important Aztec female deity was worshipped. In pre-Columbian times Tonantzin, which means our honored mother, was associated with the great salt and fresh water lakes that surrounded the Aztec capital. Tonantzin is still a title used by Nahuatl-speaking people to refer to the Virgin of Guadalupe. From an Aztec point of view, the apparition of the Virgin forms the basis of what could be seen as a movement to indigenize Catholicism in the New World, that is, to connect the phenomenon of the religious life of the Old World with the Aztec tradition. From the Church's point of view, however, the acceptance of the apparition as genuine is a strategy which brings the Aztecs into the Church by embracing the new symbolic language at the site of old rituals. In this sense, the Virgin of Guadalupe is similar to the building of the church on top of the pyramid at Cholula, as discussed above. The phenomenon of Catholic symbols replacing or overlying pre-Columbian religious forms is a regular occurrence throughout Latin America. Fig. 11.8. Fig. 11.7. The image of the Virgin of Guadalupe, which was said to have miraculously appeared on the cloak of Juan Diego in 1531. Fig. 11.8. A Catholic church on top of the Mesoamerican pyramid at Cholula, Mexico. Photograph by the author. Another important area in which to appreciate the survival of indigenous traditions throughout Latin America is the ceremonies to the dead. As we have discussed already, the ancestors and the dead played an important role in pre-Columbian traditions. They continue to do so through Day of the Dead ceremonies in Mexico and Feasts of the Dead in Peru. Both of these ceremonial occasions have been integrated into the Catholic liturgical calendar as All Souls' Day, which takes place on the 2nd of November. In Mexico, the Day of the Dead involves creating an altar to the ancestors and hosting an all-night feast in the village cemetery. These are elaborate celebrations which often involve the entire extended family. In pre-Columbian times, a similar feast, called Tepalhuatl, Festival of the Mountains, was held, which also included the construction of family altars and feasting. Quechua and Aymara-speaking people in Bolivia hold a similar celebration, Bastian 1978. Among Andean people, altars are constructed in the shape of a mountain, which they understand to be a living being. Upon death, part of the human soul enters the earth and begins a journey to the top of the mountain. In their sojourn, the souls are responsible for good harvests, and the connection between agricultural success and the ancestors is common throughout Latin America. From the top of the mountain body, the soul can be reborn into the human community once again. Day of the Dead festivities in rural Bolivian communities are intended to assist the dead in the journey back to the living. There are numerous ways in which pre-Columbian worldviews continue to exert an influence on indigenous people today. The roles of the stars, the underworld and divination in ceremonies, frequently associated with the Catholic Church, are often direct continuations of Aztec and Inca practices. Conclusion: the legacy of cultural contact. Descendants of the Aztecs and the Incas continue to emphasize the indigenous quality of their ceremonial lives. As with pre-Columbian cultures, the native people of Latin America connect religion to how they meaningfully inhabit their material worlds. There is a persistence of the civilizations of ancient America in spite of the trauma of colonial conquest. This cultural persistence is due to an understanding of religion as a mode of expression which binds a human community to the hidden dimensions of material existence. As with their ancestors, the indigenous people of today perform rituals that orient their communities to ultimate conditions of existence. Even though they had no specific words to express the concept, the ancient civilizations of the Americas practiced something that we modern people would understand as religion. The Aztecs and Incas present scholars with a distinctive, and often disturbing, case that calls into question our current understandings and interpretations of religion. The pre-Columbian worlds of the Aztecs and Incas have been worked on by the scholarly and popular imaginations over the last 500 years. They continue to exert an important influence on modern-day conceptions of civilization and religion. With each new archaeological discovery, we revisit our presumptions about these civilizations. In this way, the Aztecs and the Incas continue to influence the development of culture in ways analogous to the civilizations of the Old World. Bibliography. Arnold, Philip P. 1999. Eating Landscape, The Aztec and European Occupation of Tlalocan. Newark, University Press of Colorado. A description of the ritual landscape of the Aztec in comparison with Spanish understandings of the New World. Aveni, Anthony F. 1980. Sky Watchers of Ancient Mexico. Austin, University of Texas Press. A classic text of ancient Mesoamerican calendar systems. Bastian, Joseph W. 1978. Mountain of the Condor, Metaphor and Ritual in an Andean Ilu. Prospect Heights, Illinois, Waveland Press. A classic anthropological study of contemporary people of Bolivia. Boone, Elizabeth and Walter Mignolo, eds. 1994. Writing Without Words, Alternative Literacies in Mesoamerica and the Andes. Durham, North Carolina, Duke University Press. This text examines the relationship between text and art throughout the ancient Mesoamerican and Inca worlds. Broder, Johanna 1971. Las Fiestas Aztecas de los Dioses de la Lluvia, una reconstrucción según las fuentes del siglo XVI. Revista Española de Antropología Americana 6, 245-327. An invaluable study of the fertility cult among the Aztecs. Brotherston, Gordon 1978. Image of the New World, the American continent portrayed in native texts. London, Thames and Hudson. A comprehensive survey of native texts from throughout the Americas. Burkhardt, Louise M. 1989. The Slippery Earth, Nahua Christian Moral Dialogue in 16th Century Mexico. Tucson, University of Arizona Press. A detailed look at the relationship between pre-Columbian and Spanish worlds as revealed through their distinctive understandings of the world. Carrasco, David 1982. Quetzalcoatl and the Irony of Empire, Myths and Prophecies in the Aztec Tradition. Chicago, University of Chicago Press. This examines the famous story of Quetzalcoatl and Cortés' use of the myth to topple the Aztec Empire. 1990, Religions of Mesoamerica, Cosmovision and Ceremonial Centers. San Francisco, Harper and Row. A useful textbook regarding the phenomenon of religion in pre-Columbian Mexico. Cobo, Fray Burnaby 1990. Inca Religion and Customs, Trans. And E. D. Rowland Hamilton. Austin, University of Texas Press. A primary source which describes Inca life from a contemporary perspective. Diaz del Castillo, Bernal 1956. The Discovery and Conquest of Mexico, 1517 to 1521, trans. A. P. Maudslay. New York, Farrar, Straus, and Cuddy. Castillo was a soldier in Cortés' army, and this text gives a gritty portrayal of the fall of the Aztec Empire. Duran, Fray Diego 1971. Book of the Gods and Rites and the Ancient Calendar, ed. and trans. Fernando Horcasitas and Doris Hayden. Norman, University of Oklahoma Press. This is a primary text written by a priest in Mexico from the 16th century. Gallinier, Jacques 1983. Pueblos de la Sierra Madre, Etnografía de la Comunidad Otomí. Mexico City, Instituto Nacional Indigenista. An account of a contemporary indigenous group from Mexico which is helpful when thinking about Mesoamerican religion. Guaman Poma de Ayala, Felipe 1981. El Prima Nueva Crónica y Buen Gobierno, ed. John V. Mayer and Rolina Adorno, trans. Jorge L. Urioste. Mexico City, Siglo XXI. This is written from the point of view of an Inca nobleman who is trying to get readers to appreciate his pre-Spanish heritage. Las Casas, Bartolomé de 1992. The Devastation of the Indies, A Brief Account, trans. Herma Briffault, intro. Bill M. Donovan. Baltimore, Maryland, Johns Hopkins University Press. This text is the source of the Black legend of Spanish injustices in the New World. Las Casas was a priest who is still widely regarded as the defender of the Indian. Long, Charles H. 1986. Significations, Signs, Symbols, and Images in the Interpretation of Religion. Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, Fortress Press. Long is one of the most important theorists in the comparative study of religion. He emphasizes the importance of culture contact as a vehicle for understanding the American experience. Lopez Austin, Alfredo 1988. The Human Body and Ideology, Concepts of the Ancient Nahuas, 2 volumes, trans. Thelma and Bernard Ortiz de Montolano. Salt Lake City, University of Utah Press. A thorough analysis of the connections between the human body and the cosmos in Mesoamerica. Lopez Lujan, Leonardo 1994. The Offerings of the Templo Maya of Tenochtitlan, trans. Bernard and Thelma Ortiz de Montolano. Newark, University Press of Colorado. A detailed survey of the findings at the Templo Maya and a convincing analysis of their meaning. Motos Moctezuma, Eduardo 1995. Life and Death in the Templo Maya, trans. Bernard and Thelma Ortiz de Montolano. Newark, University Press of Colorado. This is written by the director of the Templo Mayor excavation, and he successfully integrates the importance of the site into the Aztec cosmology. Nicholson, Henry, born in 1971. Religion in Pre-Hispanic Central Mexico. In Handbook of Middle American Indians, Guide to the Ethno-Historical Sources, Volume 11, ed.R. Warchope. Austin, University of Texas Press. pp 395-445. A clear and concise description of Mesoamerican deities. Nutini, Hugo G., 1998. Todos Santos in Rural Tlaxcala, a syncretic, expressive and symbolic analysis of the cult of the dead. Princeton, New Jersey, Princeton University Press. This is a very good account of the annual ceremonies to the dead and their importance in a contemporary Nahua-speaking community. Ortiz de Montellano, Bernard R. 1990. Aztec Medicine, Health, and Nutrition. New Brunswick, New Jersey, Rutgers University Press. Often health and religion were two sides of the same coin in Mesoamerica. This is written by an anthropologist who also has command of both Mesoamerican texts and medical knowledge. Reed, K. Alma 1998. Time and Sacrifice in the Aztec Cosmos. Bloomington, Indiana University Press. An analysis of the relationship between the calendar and human sacrifice in the Aztec Empire. Sahagan, Fray Bernardino de 1951-82. Florentine Codex, General History of the Things of New Spain, 13 parts, ed. and trans. Arthur J. O. Anderson and Charles E. Dibble. Salt Lake City, University of Utah Press. Sahagan's text is the single most important and complete primary source on Mesoamerican culture. Sandstrom, Alan R. 1991. Corn is Our Blood, Culture and Ethnic Identity in a Contemporary Aztec Indian Village. Norman, University of Oklahoma Press. An invaluable look at the ritual life of modern Nahuatl-speaking people of Mexico. Shell, Linda and Mary Ellen Miller 1986. The Blood of Kings, Dynasty and Ritual in Maya Art. New York, George Brazilla. A classic account of kingly succession among the Maya. Sullivan, Lawrence E. 1988. Icanchu's Drum, An Orientation to Meaning in South American Religions. New York, Macmillan. An exhaustive exploration of the religions of the entire South American continent. Tlaloc, Barbara 1982. Time and the Highland Maya. Albuquerque, University of New Mexico Press. A personal account of her journey as a Maya shaman apprentice. Todorov, Tsvetan 1984. The Conquest of America, trans. Richard Howard. New York, Harper Torch Books. Written by a linguist, this offers a critical analysis of the contact between Spanish and Mesoamerican worlds. Ayrton, Gary 1981. At the Crossroads of the Earth and Sky, An Andean Cosmology. Austin, University of Texas Press. A classic account of a Quechua-speaking group of people and their ongoing relationship to the stars. Van der Loo, Peter 1987. Códices Costumbres Continuidad, UN Estudio de la Religión Mesoamericana. Leiden, Indian Studies 2, Archaeologisch Centrum RU. Demonstrates the importance of pre-Columbian texts for contemporary Nahuatl-speaking people of Mexico. Zudima, R. Thomas 1964. The Sex System of Cusco, the Social Organization of the Capital of the Inca. International Archives of Ethnography, Supplement to Volume 50. Leiden, E. J. Brill. A classic study of the sex system, or a system of invisible, radial lines, that emanated from the center of the Inca Empire.